Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to our session. I'm very pleased to be here at this year's National Security Conference, Securing Our Future. We've already had so many great insights over the past day and a half, and I think the special value of this year's National Security Conference is that not only, as usual, we are gathering Australia's foremost experts, but I think for the first time, we're comprehensively bridging that gap in conversation between the broader community and us tradespeople who work on national security in its various guises. I'm really privileged to be moderating this session today on the connection between social cohesion and national security. And I'm really pleased to be with this distinguished group whose work is already very deeply embedded with communities here in Australia. I'll just take a minute to briefly introduce everyone before we get started. We'll have a moderated panel discussion by myself, and then there'll be plenty of time for audience Q&A. So as you're thinking and you're gaining perspectives and insights, also hold on to your questions for the end of the session so you can throw them over to our panelists. Pleased to first introduce Dr. Wessa Chow, who's the Executive Director of Per Capita and serves on the Victorian Anti-Racism Task Force and also the National Foundation for Australian-Chinese Relations. Wessa's worked extensively across government, nonprofit, and academia on a systems level. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. We also have Professor Samina Yasmeen, who is a founding director of the Centre for Muslim States and Society at the University of Western Australia, and her work spans political and strategic developments in Southeast Asia, the role of Islam in the world, and Muslim citizenship. Next, we have Robert Samuel, who is the CEO of Shalom College and the Shalom Collective. He's also a councillor on the Willoughby City Council, and he has extensive experience in community building and governance and held previous roles in Austrade Commission. We also have with us Jorge Aroche, who is the CEO of New South Wales Service for the Treatment and Rehabilitation of Torture and Trauma Survivors. He's worked also extensively with migrant and refugee communities for many years in many different settings in the clinical, community, and organizational settings, and has a lot of experience in that as well too. And last but not least, we have Rosemary Karaoke Fife, who is the Multicultural Community Liaison Officer for the New South Wales Police. She spent many years supporting migrant and refugee communities and women especially, and she's recognized in her leadership working with the African diaspora and is also on the advisory board of Multicultural New South Wales. So please join me in welcoming all our panelists before we get started. Oh, and I should probably briefly introduce myself. My name is Lydia Khalil. I'm your moderator for the panel. I'm the program director in transnational challenges at the Lowy Institute, and also a senior research fellow at Deakin University, where I work on issues around national security, countering violent extremism, and social cohesion. So I want to first start by a question, throwing it to the entire panel. If you can just offer us an initial reflection on the community consultation report and what it says about social cohesion. I think in that report it highlighted that within the community there are very different perspectives and understandings of what social cohesion is. So I wanted to just ask initially, what's your understanding of social cohesion and how social cohesion specifically relates to national security? So did you find also that the report's findings resonated with you or reflected similarly also in the communities that you work with? And Wessa, maybe I'll start with you and then go down to the panel.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that. So I think one of the things that there's been an increased discussion on, particularly around social cohesion, is that the term itself assumes that people have to be assimilating and to not cause trouble. So people feel like that in order to create social cohesion, you have to adhere to the one narrative and often the mainstream narrative. So people now start talking a lot more about belonging. And so the framing of that is that people can bring the whole self into conversations, they don't have to feel like that they have to hide parts of themselves in order to be accepted into a specific narrative, and the narrative being social cohesion. And I also do feel that we need to have more spaces where we can have discussions where we disagree. So being able to have those challenging conversations, but at the same time, it is one of those conversations that also impacts on national security, because especially now when we talk about differences. It does mean that we don't always agree on a certain position. And once we don't agree on a certain position, then how do we have those conversations together in a way that we can actually work together in the same direction, as opposed to creating even more division and even more conflicts within the community.
Samina, please.
Thank you very much. Well, to begin with, I think my idea of social cohesion is really not one where everyone thinks and acts in the same way. It's a community consisting of communities and networks and interactions where people participate in spaces as they feel like, but while they are not participating in certain places, they don't feel that they are not part of the overall system. A sense of what Vesa said, a sense of belonging to the larger project or the larger space exists. But it's also coexists with the sense that whether you're directly involved in it or not, you're respected for what you are, and you have the ability and the chance to say what you think without being shouted down, or without being told that your narrative is not part of the overall narrative. Now, it does not mean that the right to say what you feel coexists with your right to threaten others, but it does mean that your right to engage in respectful discussions and expression of your ideas is respected by others as well, as much as you respect their rights as well. So very quickly, because I think we'll be talking about the report even in more detail, I wasn't surprised, especially because most of the work that we do at the Center for Muslim States and Societies looks at the views of Muslims and how they place themselves in a relationship to the wider communities wherever they are. And sometimes how does the wider community look at them? So I guess the report's findings are really amazing in the sense that they point out areas that already appear in the discussions, also those who are not codified in academic research, but the discussions and the ideas focus around disinformation, foreign interference, and the possibility of terrorist attacks, and realization that it has increased again. And in that, what I do want to point out, and maybe we can come to that later, that foreign interference in politics, government, economy, society intersects with the cyberspace, the provision that it creates for others to use that space to interfere. And I think looking at the Muslims, even though the report doesn't disaggregate that this is a Muslim and this is a non-Muslim, what I do feel is that there's a sense that we need to explore further, that among the Muslim community, it's not just one country or one foreign state that is trying to influence. There's a whole list of them, and the list really varies with the time that we find ourselves in, but also the connection of the original country. So everyone talks about Gaza and the policies of the Israeli government, but then also currently with the Iran conflict going on, there are different opinions within the Muslim community about what's happening in Iran and which regime needs to be supported and how it could be changed or not changed. So there are people who are quite worried about that. And
So
of course,
I think maybe that's something that we'll get to in a little bit more depth when we're talking about, as you say, the information space and how within various communities there's lots of diversity in that as well. But it seems like both of you are saying that that it's about a sense of belonging, having that sense of belonging and that ability to express an authentic self within the wider community.
exactly. And I think that's if I was to summarize a very academic discussion that probably I've been trying to present, is that the report actually gives us what the communities feel. But there are certain areas that it doesn't give us those areas, but maybe because those questions weren't asked, but maybe we can talk about them later. Thank you.
And Robert, give us your perspective too, because the report also very succinctly and I think accurately points out that social cohesion is both the country's deepest resilience asset and a site of visible strain. So that's something to kind of tease out and explore in terms of the link between social cohesion and national security.
Yes, I think it's an interesting one, and it picks up on the earlier point about the importance of belonging. I'll start by explaining what I had for lunch on Sunday. I had a hamburger with chips, and I had an orange almond cake, one of those ones that are pretty ubiquitous around the cafes of certainly Sydney and I assume Canberra. Where I had it, though, was at the Jewish Food Festival, which is one of our major set pieces at the Shalom Collective. We had about 2,000 people there. The burger that I purchased was from Lewis's, the burger joint that was firebombed under the command of state sponsors in Bondi. The orange cake was baked under the guidance of the man who's just closed down Avner's because it's no longer safe for him to run his business in Surrey Hills in Sydney. So one of the things that really leapt out at me in this report was the later findings around the fact that 77% of Australians can see the danger of violent extremism targeting parts of Australian community. 72% expect a terrorist attack. 66% organised crime targeting specific Australian people and businesses. And those numbers are quite low compared to the feelings of the Jewish community for pretty obvious reasons. And it is at the heart of the challenge that we have as a community, because I think that social cohesion is about bonding social capital, so it's about bringing individual communities together, but it's also about bridging social capital. For us to put this food festival on, I, as the CEO, was responsible for vetting the 2,000 attendees there. Now, we're an organisation of about 10 or 12 people plus some volunteers, and we have to go through that process. We had more police and more security people than we've got at this national security conference. We weren't able to have it outside like any other food festival. Now, in that sort of environment, it's very hard to have that sort of bridging social capital. I'm also the councillor at Willoughby Council. We've got one of the largest Chinese populations in Australia. And we have a Lunar New Year lantern parade. We have Taiwanese, we have people from the mainland, Hong Kong, even the Falun Gong get involved. The diversity there on offer is amazing, and everybody at Willoughby comes along to that. There are thousands and thousands of people. This is bridging capital. And what we're facing as a Jewish community now is that those options for bridging social capital are closing, and even the bonding social capital is hard, because every single time my team have one of our 200 events a year, it's a matter of life, and it's a choice of life and death. It's fear and courage and hope that's required from each and every member of my team and each and every member who chooses to attend. And this concern by the broader community, which is a clearly legitimate community, also pulls people apart, and I think it's a real challenge for social cohesion as we go forward, because we now actually understand the security context in which we're operating in. And it's clear from this research paper that Australians want to know more about that.
Yeah, I think it is very concisely, I think, and accurately how you drew that linkages between the lack of social cohesion and belonging to all of these security concerns that have been brought out. And I'm very glad that you brought up the bonding and the bridging parts of building social capital, and that's something I want to delve into a bit later. So thank you for previewing that for all of us. Jorge, what are your perspectives?
Very much agree with Robert. I'd say that social cohesion is pretty much the glue that binds us as a society and what enables us to feel that we are on the same team. I think it's been defined this morning as, the prosperity and security has been, the two, vital elements of that. And it's essential, that we feel that we're in that same team, but also around, the social contract that is defined by the rules, the regulations, the laws that we build, to define, what, that working society is. And I think in the case of Australia, I think we found a unique way of doing that by the multicultural framework. And, they were really good, questions. I think George Brandis asked a really good question the other day about, the connection and whether we can ignore people that are rallying against what they perceive as multiculturalism, wrongly, from my perspective. And the reality is that, Australia is a very diverse country. It's been made by immigration, so we all come from different places, pretty much. Particularly if we go, only a few hundred years a couple of hundred years in history. And I think the multicultural framework recognizes that. I mean, when you have a society that is already diverse, you can either ignore that diversity and try to go for assimilation and make everyone the same, or recognize that diversity and build a framework where you can build a cohesive society around that recognition. I'll tell you a little bit about where this comes from, because I am a clinical psychologist. I lead a torture and trauma service. I'm much more used to being in conferences around how the brain works and how it reacts to trauma and, settlement and so on, than national security. I think the reports, that Roy and his team have put together make an enormous contribution to unpacking the components of national security and really help to reframe, how we should see it in the context of social cohesion. So my congratulations to Rory Metcalf and his team, and also thank you for announcing that partnership. One of the frustrations that starts is that I got about 250 staff or so. We work from a biopsychosocial approach, so we provide clinical services, but we also work with communities, with schools, with young people. And often there is no outlet for the enormous amount of knowledge and lived experience perspectives that come through our work for those more than 100,000 people that we work with. And the people that we work with are the result of an absence of social cohesion, or rather a breakdown of the social contract, and therefore can provide enormously useful perspectives that can help us in finding a way forward in what is becoming a much more complex and turbulent world situation and domestic situation, as Robert was pointing out. I think some of the horrors that our clients have come to Australia to be safe from, visiting us here. And this has enormous impact on refugee populations, on people that value the social contract, that value, the safety and security that Australia offers from a perspective of not having had it. And also know intimately well the mindset of the people that try to break it down.
Yeah. So they can't take it for granted, really. So yeah.
Absolutely, and they don't, and largely, and that's an asset. It doesn't mean that we don't have, doesn't come with things that we need to address. I think that we need to continue to cultivate. There's a lot of work that we need to continue to do in terms of civic education. I think with mainstream society, but particularly with people that come from worldviews and from situations where they have not really been able to live in a working society, even though they really want to. And so sometimes, it is important that we invest in that process and nurture it.
Yeah. Rosemary.
Yeah. 2021, when I became the Australian local hero, my message was get to know your neighbor and stop living in silos. And I think that's what is social cohesion, which has become a critical issue in our nation. Strong leadership is needed to create balance and open spaces for dialogue so communities can come together with understanding and respect. These conversations are essential in strengthening social cohesion, which I believe is a foundation of national resilience. Multiculturalism, we come here with different backgrounds. Some come as refugees, some as skilled migration, some as international students, and there's not enough information for them. And if we go to the grassroots, social cohesion cannot happen if you don't know your neighbor, if you cannot talk to somebody who looks different from you. So I think we need to go to the drawing board and we start from there. I can't see why today there's a lot of racism in schools, starting from even kindy. It's because we are not handling it. If we can start from there, people knowing each other, people speaking to each other. I work in Campbelltown. And when the Bondi attack happened, I was in Cairns. And I just had come from Port Douglas, and I'm watching the TV and I'm saying, what is this happening? And I listened, and what I did, I just texted a few of my Muslim members of communities in Campbelltown Local Area Command. And I just told them, in case of anything, in case you feel threatened, just call this number, call the local police station. Unless it's emergency, you call 000. And just that word brought a lot of calm. People just want to be reassured. And we come together. We know each other. We don't wait until things are bad. That's when we come together. We have to know who is who. And we have to continue talking to each other. We have to stop living in silos. Government don't talk to each other. Departments don't talk to each other. Communities doesn't talk to each other. During this Ramadan, I attended like 5 iftar dinners. And it was so powerful because one of them, it was done in a loud tempo, but in a hall, and financed by Affinity, which is a Muslim organization. There was Uniting Church, there was Baha'i, there was all religions presented there. You looked at that room and you could see social cohesion. A woman who have just been brought here on spouse visa, she doesn't know anybody. And by bad luck, if she gets a controlling or abusive husband, 4 years they're locked in the house. And by good luck, if somebody maybe calls the police or a GP or somebody, then she comes out of that. And one of the ladies told me after Christmas, because I invited her for Christmas, because she has no one. She was admitted in hospital, a mental hospital, because of being isolated. And when I went to see her, she was so happy. She's as if she had seen her mother. She had not answered her questions, filled the form, because she did not have a next of kin. And I said, put me as your next of kin. Then I remembered during Christmas time, she doesn't have anyone. And I said, oh, come to my place. And she came and we stayed with her 3 days. And when she left, she sent me this message. I now feel I belong.
So, Rosemary, that's a really interesting example that you're pointing to of that different type of social capital. So, Robert, you spoke about the bridging capital, and you're talking about that bonding capital, right? So, kind of within those communities, but also that getting to know your neighbor, which is bringing those two things together, which I think is so important to point out as all being part of what we talk about when we mean social cohesion. I'm wondering if we could just move the conversation to this issue around mis and disinformation, which I think is really impacting our social cohesion, the social contract, so many things, our civic knowledge, everything in so many ways, this polluted information environment. And the community consultation report also highlights the role of it in driving polarization and threatening social cohesion. So I wanted to ask you and the panel, can you break down this for us in a little bit more concrete terms? Because there's kind of this nebulous understanding of disinformation is bad, it has harmful impacts, but in concrete terms in your work, how do you see disinformation driving that polarization and then impacting social cohesion? Robert, can I start with you on that one?
Yes, I'll start with another local councillor, Zan Maxwell, who's on the City of Sydney, whose comments after Bondi were, when they warned that the escalation they were living through could lead to mass murder of Jews, I struggled to see it, not here, not in Sydney. But what can be misread as alarmism is in fact pattern recognition informed by history and lived experience of Jews, to which I would add other communities in Australia who have lived in societies who have torn each other apart. And the minister last night spoke a little bit about the heightened temperatures. But these languages are often coded. They're coded, but they're understood by those who are speaking it, and they're understood by those who are receiving it. So on the steps of the Opera House, we heard, "Fuck the Jews" and "Where's the Jews?" Now, in my family, my wife is a sexual assault doctor. We were within 48 hours of mass rapes in the Gaza envelope. And my children were about to go to school in their Jewish school uniforms. And so we had to have the sort of conversation that no Australian parent should ever have to have with their children. But the language that was used was deliberate, it was understood by those who said it, and it was understood in small places by those who received it. As a councillor, I attended a local government conference on anti-Semitism. I received an attack on the floor of council by one of my councillors. Most of them supported me. And the debate was about the definition of anti-Semitism and whether or not Israel had a right to exist, and a whole complex debate that really had no place on the floor of a council. But the person delivering the message knew what he was saying, and the person receiving the message, me, knew. And my fellow councillors sat around bewildered, not understanding any of it. And I think that this is the challenge of this language. The further challenge, and I'm an IT consultant originally, is that often these groups were hidden in the shadows, but now they're out and about and visible. So one of the volunteer positions I have is on a committee at the Great Synagogue in Sydney. So I sit in and I see the comments that are put on Facebook against that organisation. And I have to say most of them are wonderful, but some of them are horrendous. But they're well known and understood to the people receiving them. They are all the anti-Semitic tropes that we know about global conspiracies, about money, about controlling decisions in the world. And these are well-known languages, and I guess that's at the heart of the challenge that we've got. We all sat round and listened to a police report where they said where's the Jews? It doesn't, it doesn't mean anything. But of course, in Bondi, after Bondi, we know what that means. And for our community and for other communities, we've been listening to that not since Bondi and not for the last 2 years, but for decades. So we recognise the patterns and we hear the patterns.
So it's an information environment that's characterized by disinformation, conspiracy, narratives that can then be used to target various groups. Samina, you had a perspective on this.
Well, I was going to say I'm glad, but I'm not glad that you shared that story, because I think it actually tells us there are people in our communities who do not look at other fellow Australians from the same point of view of what I said, respecting them as well as expecting respect for yourself. But I think talking about the disinformation and what does it mean in terms of impacting on social cohesion, I'd like to reflect on Muslim experience. When I came to Australia, to ANU, and I don't be surprised, 46 years ago, and did my master's, people didn't really look at me as a Muslim woman. I was a South Asian Pakistani woman who wore Pakistani outfits. But after the 1990s, when the conflict started between Iraq invading Kuwait, suddenly my Muslim identity started being recognized. But after 9/11, and again, I'm trying to personalize it, suddenly I had changed from being an academic who works on security issues and loved guns and bombs at the theoretical level, not reality. Suddenly I was that academic who was a Muslim academic. So I think at one level, this identification as a Muslim woman gave me an insight into how does the community sometimes view Muslims, and where the difference in terms of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, I think, comes, at least to me, which is worth recognizing, is that Muslims have had a longer time frame in Australia, in which they've experienced not coded messages, but very open messages. Getting a message to say, I hope you get run over by a truck, is a very unfriendly comment at the very early ages of computer technology. But there are women that we know earlier who were experiencing just being thrown rubbish on their heads because they wore scarf. There are women who were targeted because they were Muslim women. And then there were women like me who don't cover their head, who were told that you're not really Muslim enough. So that kind of Islamophobia, I think, has been part of Muslim experience. And as external events, external to Australia, become noticed by us, suddenly the impact on Muslims in terms of Islamophobia increases. And I think we can't get away from the fact that after 9/11, that was a very sad story. 2010s, with ISIS rise, Islamophobia became very obvious. Everybody talked about it. And just when Muslims felt that now they can feel comfortable and not be identified as Muslim, and I'm not talking about myself personally, but Muslim community in general, suddenly happens Bondi. And I think we have to accept that it's one of the most horrific things that we could ever experience in Australia. But what did it do to Muslims? I remember there were Muslims who were waiting there saying, please let that not be a Muslim. But they were Muslims. And then there was this other sense, please find a way, God, please find a way in which Muslims can at least establish their credentials as good citizens. Among Pakistani community, because of the name, there were Pakistani Muslims who were saying, please God, don't let that be a Pakistani Muslim, because then from their point of view, Indian government would start using. So I think what I'm really trying to get at is, from Muslim point of view, Islamophobia has not been existing in coded form. It's been very open. It's been obvious. It's been targeting women and men, and it's impacted on their access to jobs. And it has affected them, and not necessarily always in the right way, but it's created a sense that somehow they are not equal citizens, which creates the possibility of anger, which, as you would know, can sometimes be translated into extremist activities like what we saw in Bondi.
But it's so interesting what you were saying about the reaction of so many members of the Muslim community when they said, "Well, please don't let this be that," or "Please." It actually points to something, I think, something so positive, in that there is an undercurrent within the broader community of a rejection of these things. Which is something we have to appreciate.
Absolutely, and I think that's where the broader terms used within the Islamophobia efforts, from the point of view of those who engage in this, they actually miss out the fact that with 800,000 plus Muslims, if every Muslim was a militant, Australia wouldn't be worth living in.
Yeah. So we've talked about these issues about, narratives or isms or phobias and disinformation, conspiracies toward other people. But one of the other things that I think impacts social cohesion is this economic insecurity or inequality or precarity as well. And Wes, I was wondering if I could turn to you on this one. Talk to us a bit about how that can erode resilience and faith in institutions and fracture social cohesion, because that economic insecurity also tends to breed particular resentments and lack of trust in institutions as well. So talk to us about how economic conditions can be linked to social cohesion.
Yeah, I think what is really interesting that's happening right now is there's a lot of discussions around housing and how the debate around the lack of housing and that is linked to immigration. And I think it kind of relates to that, where if people don't feel like that their foundations is safe, then they find someone else to blame. And it's usually the migrant communities that are blamed. And we see that with the Muslim community. We also see that with the African communities and also the Chinese communities as well. So there's always this phase where there's an underlying racism that's there. And whenever there's incidents, when it comes to, a lack of economic security, when there are at the moment we've got a housing crisis. People feel like that they have to find this other group of people to blame, and it's usually fueled also through now, especially through social media. It's much easier to create messages that is divisive rather than based on facts, and it's easier to share as well. And also, this is now what I'm also seeing, particularly with the Chinese community, because with the Chinese community, we also have Chinese language social media. And in those spaces, there are less people who know the actual source to actually try and, say those messages are incorrect. And so you are now also seeing some communities also getting worked up through those platforms because of, it's very similar messages, but then they feel like, well, for the Chinese community, they might feel like, well, I've been here for many years. It's the newer migrants that are the problem. And so we then continue to get this cycle of it's always the new migrants that are the problem. And until we start to actually find a way to bring communities together, and as Rosemary was saying, understanding your neighbours, talking to your neighbours and seeing them as human beings, as opposed to, this other group of people trying to take our resources, we can't create that environment.
Well, we definitely saw it, I think, late last year and into the summer with the anti-immigration rallies that unfortunately we were seeing in Australia, where there was a lot of that scapegoating, right? And maybe coming from that sense of precarity, but also very interesting to hear people say, oh, well, my neighbor Mahmoud is great, but I don't want, migrants. So there's really this kind of disconnect sometimes between the personal and the neighborliness versus these broader things. Rosemary, can I ask you as well, you work with communities sometimes who also experience economic precarity as well. How do you see that playing out in the communities you work with?
Yeah, within the multicultural communities, there's a lot of issues, starting when they come here, let's say they are skilled migrants. They are doctors. I've seen, and I work a lot, I talk about women because I work a lot with the women, although I work with across the board. Somebody who have been come here was a GP back home, let's say in Bangladesh or somewhere. And when they come here, they're abusive, they cannot leave the house, they are refused even to do, change their qualifications to suit here. And by the time they leave that abusive relationship, maybe it is about 6-7 years, their confidence is back to zero. Some engineers come from Africa. They come here, they cannot get the job because they have done so many interviews. They have changed even their qualifications to suit here, but they cannot get a job. There are people who have changed their names so that they can get a job. And we have a lot of qualified people from multicultural backgrounds. And if we stop discriminating with these people because they are maybe a different accent, different community, we are losing a lot of resources from them. Another thing you mentioned about housing. Our communities, let's say, for example, the Africans, we have big families. When they come here, they're struggling to settle. They are a family of 10 or 6, they're given 2-bedroom house. How do you think they're gonna settle? And by the time they settle, to start looking for a job, they are very isolated because most of the times they are put in a place where they have no one who they can relate to. So if we can be able to work when they come here, whether they have come here as refugees, whether they have come here, whatever way they have come, and we can pick from the immediate instead of losing that manpower, we would be ahead in a very big way. So information, sharing information is very, very important. And what I find through my experience, Australians don't give information. And it's not because they want to, they wait until you ask. How can you ask something you don't know? Where we come from, we don't have the services which are here. And I can give an example. There's this lady who had a PhD in her country, and she wanted to help other women not to go through what she went through. So she went to TEF and enrolled herself to do a diploma. Then when she came and told me, I said, how can you do diploma when you have a PhD? I sent her to go to university to see a career advisor to advise her what subjects she can do so that she can change her qualifications to work as a lawyer here. And after 1.5 years today, she's supporting the women as a lawyer. Because as a social worker, there's so many people down here. But she didn't know she can do that. So information, sharing information is very, very important. You better not give me money or food and give me information, because that information I'll use in so many different ways. Thank you.
The one thing that the report highlighted was this issue of reactivity. Like we face many challenges, many crises. It's been described that we're in this era of kind of a permit crisis where there's one conflict or issue that after another, whether it be dealing with an overseas conflict, a terrorist attack, natural disaster. But there's this sense of this institutional pattern of reactivity that we respond, immediately to a crisis, but that there's not enough work being done in the prevention side of it beforehand, or even after a crisis response has happened, then it just kind of goes back to business as usual, and we don't absorb either lessons learned or really institutionalize things in a lot of ways. So I was wondering if the panel can respond to that issue about how can we get out of that cycle of reactively responding to crises so that we can make sure that our social cohesion is resilient for so many of those things. Rosemary, do you want to start?
Yeah, maybe I can continue. I left here. I find departments don't talk to each other until a calamity has happened. That's when you start looking for, let's say, for example, I work with the police. That's when I'm running to the council. I'm running to the other agencies. But going back to, I like using examples, real examples which work. In my area, Campbelltown, we have 6 weeks meetings with all the religious leaders, with community leaders, where we meet and we see what issues are we having in our area. Let's say, for example, it's the youth. We address that. When the Bondi happened, we address that. When maybe when it is so hot and elderly people. So having those meetings, often you don't have to wait until calamity happens that you start looking for Jane and James and everybody else. So let us be ready before something happens, and also talking to each other. So that's, yeah, what I can add.
Look, I'm going to be a bit provocative here, because the problem with prevention is that, you only know when it doesn't work. And I'd say that if you compare, and I was the president of the umbrella body for torture and trauma services around the world, and so I traveled to a lot of other places. And in comparison, Australia has been doing a lot, and probably got a much better track record in terms of social cohesion, and also in terms of the number of, terror attacks and so on. So let's not throw the baby with the bathwater. I think that certainly in New South Wales, and I think it's happening elsewhere, since, there's a refugee resettlement working group that looks at resettlement, that looks at coordinating, what is happening. There's been a fabulous investment in looking after, the mental health and impact of torture and trauma and the things that refugees come with, which is a, fabulous investment. I think it's probably saved billions to the economy in terms of preventing, not from the other aspects of security, preventing, money going in a lot of other ways that would be reactive. So there's been a lot done in that area. Of course, there's a lot of ground to do a lot more. I think that it's important to be responsive to events, but avoid knee-jerk reactions. And we've seen a few of those, unfortunately. And I think we need to be, we all need to be, but certainly our political leaders need to be a lot more careful in that sense. But I think it's important to learn from the things that we've done well, continue to do them, and there's certainly a lot of room for improvement in that area.
And you bring up something important that sometimes, though it doesn't feel like it, comparatively, Australia has a very high level of social cohesion. And I mean, in the work that you do, as you mentioned earlier, that you're dealing with the aftermath of what happens when societies collapse, and so you see the other side of it. So, and to the panelists as well, if you also want to comment on kind of where Australia sits comparatively around social cohesion, and what we can highlight about what we do well, would welcome those reflections too.
Yes, well, we hear in the report that we want communities that are peaceful and safe, and I think that that's at the heart of our challenge, and I think it's at the heart of what we're doing as a community. There's a late Jewish rabbi and philosopher, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who talks about the home we build together. And it is a critique against identity politics, but it's also about how to build a cohesive society. And he talks about a country as being, or a society as being a country house, a country manor, where the lord of the manor invites people in, they can stay for a while, but then they need to go. He talks about a society which is like a hotel. Everybody can stay in their own hotel room and do their own thing, and there's very little mutual obligation. But as long as you behave yourself, as long as you do the right thing, you can stay. But a hotel's not a home. And he says that the communities that we need to build together today is the home that we build together. We don't really quite know what that home's going to look like, but we're going to work on it together. And in the aftermath of Bondi, for my community, as I talk, for instance, to my English relatives about what happened when Jews were killed outside a synagogue, the response in Bondi was materially different. It was a personal attack on every Australian, and we talked a little bit about how the Muslim community felt personally just by that event, but I think every Australian felt at Bondi something was violated. And it was a response against that we saw immense pressure on our federal government to take things a great deal more seriously than I think they were prepared to initially. And I think this home we build together is something that we've seen coming out of Bondi. It's something that I see in my own business as we create events and as we work with people like Multicultural New South Wales to bring in other people and allies. But I think that really at the heart of us dealing with this constant barrage of crises is to be quite deliberate in that objective. And I think the objective of a peaceful and safe community, which is what really comes out very strongly in No Worries, is at the heart of that.
Thank you very much for sharing those ideas. I was just thinking, I was both happy and unhappy that Minister Burke yesterday talked about 3 different developments. Bondi attack, then on the Australia Day attack, which luckily didn't result in any casualties in Perth, and then the planning in Western Australia. It doesn't say the right thing about Western Australia. It's a nice place. But the reality is that he has drawn our attention while asking to keep the temperature down to the fact that we are living in a different world now. It's not the Australia that I came to and the Australia that we all knew. It has had definitely a very good record compared to other countries, other multicultural countries, in terms of social cohesion. But I think in order to avoid reactivity, the starting point for us would be to recognize that these are the trends, dynamics that are existing in our society now that are not dominant, but they run the risk of fracturing cohesion because they create fear among people, constant fear, lack of trust, a sense that you can't say what you really feel because somebody would label you as being anti-whatever. And I think in that sense, the starting point is, one, which I'm glad that Minister Burke did say, to talk about bringing the temperature down. But the other thing that I think what we need to do is have collaborative efforts. As someone who's been in academia for all those years, I'm quite intrigued by the fact that we develop co-designing, but we don't actually work beyond 1 or 2 partners. I think the reality is Australian multicultural society is an asset for us, but we need to bring in everyone who is willing to be party to making sure that that asset doesn't erode its value. And that requires government activism, constant activism in building spaces. That requires efforts on part of the community organizations. That requires effort on part of the community-made leaders of organizations to leave the space for women to have a say. And that also requires efforts on part of the academia and business to work together to say, how do we create conditions in which Australia remains that lucky country, and while recognizing that those dangers, that we don't see another event like that. I think that requires constant effort, but it doesn't happen without money, and that's where I think, even though I loved guns and bombs and intercontinental ballistic missiles, I think it's time now that the government seriously look at investing more in building social cohesion and then talking about increasing the defense spending, which our government isn't, but there are suggestions, and that's a coded word. I hope you know what I mean.
Yeah, I just wanted to also link into the session that we had earlier today as well, because I think there's a lot that was said where there are pockets and community groups and the multicultural sector who have, these infrastructures in place. And during COVID, a lot of these were activated because it was necessary. And I think it goes to the point of, well, how do we not be reactive to a crisis in order for that to happen? And after COVID, a lot of that has discontinued because of the lack of funding. And I guess from my perspective is also thinking about, as you mentioned, how do we ensure that we actually recognise a lot of the work that the community members actually do? Because many of them do volunteer their time. The time is not paid, but then as soon as they need to start working, they can't contribute the time as needed. And people also kind of assume that as long as you are someone from the community that you can do the job, which is not true. Like, there are certain personalities and characteristics that people need in order to connect all these people to the infrastructure, and also delivering messages that is trusted. And you don't get those people if you don't actually invest in them. And often those people are also part-time as well, or voluntary. And if we continue, well, if we can map these communities out, we know some of them, you know, where they are. There's a lot of the community groups that already exist, and be able to, I guess, find a way to bring them in and continue engaging with them before any crises that happen. And then when a crisis happens, you can then activate those networks. But it does require a national effort, and it does require government actually recognising the contributions of the communities.
Well, we know that we have many challenges to overcome, but I know that this panel made me feel a lot better about the state of our social cohesion if we have such excellent thought leaders helping guide the way. So please join me in thanking our panel, and thanks for being with us.